Hello again from the National Liberal Club, the Defence and Security Circle based in London. My name's Noel Hadjimichael, and we're doing our Focus on Fake series, a range of podcasts, videocasts, some in-person events, but importantly today, on video, with her fabulous voice and her fabulous character and personality, we've got Pamela Williamson. Pamela is from New Zealand, a long way away from London, but very close to some things that are happening around the world that are catching our attention. So first and foremost, thank you, Pamela. Welcome to Focus on Fake.
You're most welcome, Noel. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm not going to ask you any embarrassing questions, but I am very jealous of the fact that you're in a beautiful country a long way away from the dark and dismal weather of London. So well done you. I can see the sunshine. Importantly, what's the environment in New Zealand? Because we only get a little bit of news around the world, and often it's great news, but sometimes, sadly, it's tough news. So what's happening in New Zealand, especially in this whole area of fake news, disinformation, and some really hostile, toxic social media?
The great question. Well, right now, New Zealanders are what I would call overexcited. We've all been let out of our little prisons. Auckland did it the toughest. We had over 100 days in lockdown, and there's been a contentious reopening, a contentious conversation about timing. But what has been most concerning about it all, apart from the fact that people are jubilantly escaping and going to bars and doing all the things that the experts, the public health experts, are still saying, don't do this, not yet, not with Omicron on the horizon. It isn't here yet, but it's in Australia, I understand, obviously in the UK and elsewhere. And it's only a matter of time before it pops up here. So there are there's a lot of cautionary advice coming from the epidemiologists and the virologists that is probably being very much ignored by the excited people who don't care. They're just so sick of it that they want to get out there, have fun. It's Christmas, and the government really has decided it doesn't have the social license to keep people locked up, which is what the experts are advising. So it's a mixed blessing. I'm delighted to be able to do more, but I'm not really doing a lot more than I was before because I'm in the vulnerable age group and I have no intention of getting too excited. I come from a medical family who I've had the warnings all the way through COVID about how to conduct myself. And I'm just watching on the sidelines. And I live semi-rurally, so I'm not actually watching it in person, but I have family in the greater Auckland area and they are noticing, and television news is showing people pouring out into the streets and into the, restaurants and bars. And I just hope that we're going to be, we're 90+% vaccinated here in Auckland. We're on the verge of being 90% throughout the country, which is an extraordinary achievement.
It's a very impressive set of numbers, and also recognising that even though on the globe, on the map, on Google Maps, New Zealand seems small, knowing so much about your country, I know that also it is actually quite a large country in geography, and there's a lot of people who don't live on top of each other. There's a lot of elbow space, and there's a lot of people in regional and rural areas. And that's a bit like Yorkshire in Britain or Brittany in France. They're a long way from the capital city. They're a long way from the big metropolitan concentrations. And that can also feed into a sense of cultural isolation, and maybe a little bit of hesitation and skepticism and cynicism about big city media and stuff that comes from the big smoke. So is there...
Well, exactly. And from the government. I wouldn't compare it to places like Yorkshire. We have a lot of rural settlements that are pretty isolated. They're areas of high poverty, often low vaccination rates, because I believe the government, much as I love Jacinda and appreciate many of the early steps that have been made to protect New Zealanders and me and my family, they made an early strategic mistake, in my view. They failed to start a vaccination education campaign early. And they were pressured constantly by the media, by experts, to start their campaign before the vaccine rollout. And unfortunately, our Prime Minister had a belief system, I don't know where she got it from, that we didn't need to do that. In fact, that would be counterproductive, that people would get all hyped up about vaccination but be frustrated that they couldn't go and have one right then and there. But what that did is it created space for all the misinformation, that the anti-vaxxers filled that gap, and particularly over social media, and rural Maori, in particular, communities have got a lot of their information, probably most of their information, from the anti-vaxxers. And many are still now fearing that this is a colonialist attempt by the government to implant chips to follow them, chips in their arms to follow them.
So this seems to be one of the themes from our series, that when we looked at Focus on Fake, when we did our launch in London on the 1st of December, we had the audience from across the UK, but across the world as well. And when you asked what is fake news, it came back many-fold, lots and lots of different examples. Some of it was political information and news. Some of it was opinion about science, the law, justice, Indigenous rights, gender issues. There seemed to be every conceivable topic where there might be even 1.5 perspectives or views. Fake news is there, lurking in the shadows, and I'm going to blame these devices, in many ways bombarding us, be it the 14-year-old who lives on their phone, the 24-year-old who's really busy with work and life, but still is incredibly hooked up, and even somebody like me in their 50s who wasn't a digital native but had to adapt to survive. And we're all under an avalanche of information, much of it unverifiable or poorly verified, and much of it published from sources that are obscure and also often driven by very harmful, toxic, divisive narratives. Now, I've painted a particularly bleak picture. Give me some good news or give me the reality. Is it really that tough at the moment in the information space? Because you're not just an author and someone on social media, but you're also a narrative strategist. You understand the way people communicate and how to get across a message. So give me the hard facts.
Well, just to backpedal slightly, I read an awful lot about the hardware and the technology that is required to combat fake news, disinformation, misinformation. And there are a lot of terminology problems for a start. What is the difference between fake news and misinformation? What is the difference between misinformation and disinformation? And in a nutshell, disinformation is really what drives conflict and confusion and chaos. And it's not always untruths that disinformation is driving. It can be a mixture. On the one hand, it can be fake news that is the message du jour. But on another day, it might be the complete opposite, closer to the truth. And it's all designed to confuse people and have them lose faith in the usual trusted sources of information, such as good journalism, educators, their own GPs in the case of COVID. Yes. So the chaos that is being created is not just happening within societies. It is being driven by outside malign influence operations.
So
and that's
in
not
some ways, somebody's driving these vehicles of hate and division and discord and harm.
Yes.
Even though sometimes the design of the platforms and the spaces that we interact with, be it Facebook, Google, Instagram, TikTok, you name it, all of those various sort of virtual realities in terms of we all have more than one way to talk to each other now, generally, and often depend on different platforms for different types of communication. It seems that it's the externals, be it a criminal gang or a very unfriendly state or really ugly, toxic, and we've seen in Britain, racism, transphobia, Islamophobia, you name it, anything like anti-Semitism, social division, anything that's ugly and gets people hot under the collar, cranky, and impulsive to be engaged, seems to be the pressure points now, which is really incredibly tiring for anyone who is communicating in today's world.
That's right. And what you're finding is that there are interest groups that are migrating across issues now. So they might start off as anti-vaxxers, but other types of interest groups join them. And they all get fueled by external agencies to collaborate with each other. The far right is driving a lot of it, but the far right is being manipulated by hostile adversaries. They're a tool. And so what you're finding is that the ordinary person now is actually getting specifically targeted. It's not just coming across their social media. There's now research that shows that the Internet Research Agency, the Russian IRS, before elections, they now have enough data to specifically target individuals. And so
that's a fascinating but incredibly frightening situation, considering when I was teaching at university only 10, 15 years ago, in something as sexy at that stage, if you can believe it, good old me, in cyber law, people were looking at privacy issues and were really worried about their ability to stay not so much hidden, but to retain control of their data and to retain their anonymity. And you're really telling me there is the ability by external people in a big brother way to target Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones or your auntie or your niece. Literally, it can be down to the individual.
Yes, it's right down from that macro state and non-state level right down to the micro individual. Absolutely.
Wow. So
that's one of the most
have we fallen into this? Like, did we actually contribute to this by doing all the apps and giving people all the data and, oh, it's free, therefore I'll use it? Like, have we been dumb, or have just we been, human nature says, go with the flow? Have we fallen into a trap?
I think what we have done is underestimate our adversaries. We are so far behind the eight ball in identifying the strategies that Russia and China, because I'm going to name names, and
That's why we invited you
it could be Iran, but the big players are clearly Russia, who have led the way. China is playing catch up with Russia. They're learning an awful lot from how Russia does it, because although China has all the tech and the AI, they're really clunky about their messaging, whereas Russia has had decades of active measures, which are the hostile strategies to disrupt and undermine the West and its institutions, so that they lose faith in democracy. And that is the fundamental goal, of course, of these authoritarian powers, is to undermine democracy so they implode from within, that they can engineer the fall of governments, pick leaders who will help them revise the rule of law to the way that suits them and their agenda. And have we been stupid? I think we've been very complicated. You know, I mean, if you look at something like the United States, they have all of their intelligence agencies. I think they've got about 17 of them. I've lost count how many intelligence agencies they have. The lack of coordination amongst these silos has only just been recently addressed.
And even though they had this Homeland Security, we've all seen the program on Netflix and the other channels, there's nothing like a good spy novel to make you worry.
But that's Cold War mentality that is driving those types of things. What's most dangerous now to democracies are the millions and millions of fake profiles, fake videos, fake images, fake identities that are being rolled out across Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. And these are highly coordinated. And so what we're belatedly doing, and the US is leading the way to some extent, although in many ways they've taken the lead from Europe, because there are some pretty incredible think tanks and do tanks in Europe. I'm looking at NATO Stratcom Centre of Excellence. And Riga, and also RAN, the Radicalization Awareness Network. So there's a number of these groups that were doing it well before the US got involved. In fact, when I started my dissertation in the middle of my master's dissertation into Russian disinformation and the effectiveness of counter-narratives and how to immunize populations against disinformation, there was very little out there. That the most exciting stuff was being done in Europe. And everything I read coming out of the United States was that they were saying we need more research, we need to be coordinating and collaborating across our silos. And I was very, very pleased to see recently that the University of Southern Florida, in conjunction with US SOCOM, Special Forces Operation University, has now got a Russian disinformation hub that they have parked there to actually train people. And this has been a long time coming. I was pointing out the deficiencies in military collaboration in the United States forces in 2017. Now we're starting to see far more awareness, far more effective approaches, but there are still real difficulties in understanding the nature of what we're contending with. People are still looking at what I call the mode of delivery, which is AI, bots, millions and millions of bots, but basically artificial intelligence. What my friend Dr. Rand Waltzman, who used to be the Deputy Chief Technology Officer at Rand Corporation, he's an absolute expert. He's a cognitive scientist, and he understands the mass democratization of disinformation and how anybody can do it now. Anybody on just a little downloadable app from Google. Reface is a good example, and I did one for a playful example of it, and I posted it on LinkedIn, which is me being Wonder Woman, and just my face bunged on Wonder Woman's body, which inspired me. I'm not sure how many other, but it is so simple and easy to do. And people are starting to lose the ability to differentiate between the fake images and the real images, and real world consequences are being happening. In fact, in India, Rand uses India as a really good, a horrible, perfect, horrible example of how murders, vigilante mobs killed people because they were deluded into thinking some poor guy was responsible for multiple rapes in the district, and he was murdered.
So we're talking well beyond harmful, toxic disruption and interference, and we're talking about lethal, caustic, incredibly violent towards society impacts. And I'm thinking of all the fault lines about our modern societies, full of generational differences, full of racial, gender, political, ideological diversity. People aren't all the same. People have never been all the same, but we seem to be in an era where there is identity politics, there is mixed messages, and there is this a desire to understand the world, but we're understanding it through the window of this technology, which seems to be at the mercy of either charlatans, criminal thugs, or in maybe its most serious way, deeply antagonistic and harmful toxic states who are operating against our societal values, and they get benefit when Maori and non-Maori in New Zealand, when city versus country in Poland, when Brexit versus Remain in Britain, when secular versus religious in France are pitted against each other. It seems
and
that our societies are absolutely being preyed upon. And when I look at NATO, I look at our collective security, it's a world away from when I was young, when in the Cold War, what you see on television, what you see in the old movies, even some of the movies that keep on being made, there were red lines, but there was a degree of you knew which side of the river you stood. And here we are in like a mosh pit, and so much of it is horrible, toxic, and dangerous. Maybe I've painted too bad a picture. I don't know.
No, you haven't. But what is misunderstood, coming back to that, is the cognitive aspects of fake news. This is something that's been academically researched, but what needs to be transmitted to everyday people is how that works without being blinded by science, because it's actually very simple. The research has shown that our brains distort and process information differently, and it depends on our age, our education level, our ability to reason, the knowledge, the pre-existing knowledge that we have, and what is called familiarity and source heuristics, meaning the shortcuts the brain takes for a piece of information coming in, and the receiver, the brain, dealing with it. And it's really an automatic process, because the inattention we have in our busy lives, we don't always have the time or the inclination to go to, do all the fact checking and source checking. Many of us do that. More people need to do that systematically, but everyday people don't do this. And so what happens is that their existing biases, their emotional state, their political prejudices or whatever, they all come into play. And the idea being, you hear what you want to hear, you see what you want to see. But those things coming in are manipulating pre-existing, if you like, the narrative ground that people exist on, their identities, their social identities, political, you name it, personal.
So if I were to bring you back to, I'm living in London, I'm living in the United Kingdom, I'm literally on the northwestern edge of Europe, but Europe is more than 24 countries. NATO is 30 nations. Yes, importantly, Canada and the US, but you've got the front line of NATO is often seen as the Mediterranean and to the east. And you've got the Baltic states, Poland, Romania. We've got all these tensions, all this drama, all this ugliness around us, as well as within our societies. And we've had COVID. And let's not even get started about the fake news about it must have been some product from New Zealand or somewhere else that caused the COVID, blah, blah, blah. Like the stories you see about even the pandemic have given us this insight into we're being played. And we're being played by people that we can't see, or we can see only a little bit. So if I was 15 or 20 or 25, should I be angry that there's no level playing field? That even though we can all have the same devices and the same access, my brain and my way of understanding information has been conditioned by this revolution of technology which has happened in my lifetime. So is that something that the very young are really under pressure and really up against it?
Most certainly there are, because there is no level playing field for a start, socially or in education, development. There is no level playing field. That's an illusion, that's a myth. We would all like that to be so, and governments try and ameliorate the gaps, but the fact remains is that your level of it's more your ability to housekeep your brain. It's being able to deal with mental clutter. And this is where the good news happens for the young, because the younger you are, the better you are at housekeeping your brain, meaning, garbage in, garbage out. You get garbage in the manner of fake news that comes in. You have an ability that is better than older people to get rid of the rubbish. And
that's great news. That's great news.
It is. And this is research-based. I was double checking it this week because I knew this was coming up.
You'd do that.
Yes. Well, you develop skills to do these things, but you do need the education system to get involved heavily. And I know that that's happening in a lot of places, but it's not happening enough. It needs to be standard topic in schools, and it's being taught examples and taught how to seek good information, because the reality is that fact-checking and truth-seeking is only part of it. It's a very important part of it, but it's not the whole story, because this is where narrative comes in, and how much you're being manipulated by external input. You know, if you cannot deal with that, you're on the back foot. And so the ability to really regulate your own cognitive workspace is a critical skill. Critical thinking is basically what I'm talking about. But it's more to do with the difference between the narrative ground that you're on and the stories that come in via fake news, which overlay that. So you've got your pre-existing base personality, your identity, your foundation, your identities, of which we have multiple. And then you've got the stories that come in over that, and what you are more inclined to accept or reject based on what your cultural narratives are telling you. Well, and you know, you look at Afghanistan and the cultural difference between the US forces that came in and the cultural narratives, and I'm talking about the counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan, and the ability to connect was very, very difficult unless you were really an anthropologist coming in, and they did try that, but that was a fail, which for other reasons, ethically really. But you know, matching the right people with the audience is incredibly important. And the Maori people found this in New Zealand, is that they were getting talked at by the Ministry of Health, who are by and large Pākehā, meaning white people, who had very little understanding of the cultural narratives and also the level of defiance about interference of government in their lives, you know, forcing vaccinations on them, and the mistrust. And so, you know, the Maori health providers have found it incredibly difficult. It's been an outrage. And really the Waitangi Tribunal at the moment is in progress to look at the government's failure to activate Maori health providers to go into rural communities and communicate with rural Maori.
I can see that as we're coming to the close, what you've really built is it's a Sistine Chapel or a collage of really interesting, fascinating yet frightening colours and shapes. It seems like it's like a patchwork quilt. There's a lot of pieces that are all sort of connected, but there is a golden thread. It's all about people, and it's about people understanding that they've got to do a little bit themselves. It's a bit like, in some ways, we ask people to be their better self, to live a healthier lifestyle, to take on values that are positive, inclusive, and respectful. And in some ways, if we're going to train our bodies and our societies to be more inclusive, more healthy, more sustainable in all of these debates, maybe we have to train our minds to tackle information, tackle the conflicts between maybe two opposing perspectives, and understand that we're not just individuals and we're not just a mass, it's a combination. Because I think the take home from you today has been individuals can be and are being targeted, but in that way, all of us are under threat and all of us are in peril, because the countries of Europe, you drive 50 miles, 100 miles, and you cross several borders. There is so much integration. The countries of NATO have been together for so long, 7 decades. Our grandparents, our great-grandparents' time, they came out of conflict and misery from the Second World War and the beginnings of the Cold War. And I would love to say things are getting better, but I don't think they are. That's why Focus on Fake turned up, and that's why we've been to places like Edinburgh, like London, and we're reaching out to people in Canada, in New Zealand, in Spain, in India. This is a bigger conversation because the globe is a lot closer, especially for those who are digital natives. Pamela Williamson, thank you for adding such value and such insight to Focus on Fake. On behalf of NATO Public Diplomacy and the National Liberal Club in London, thank you very much.
Thank you, Noel.